The Nungate was a great place, indescribable. There were a big difference between Haddington. Of course, the Nungate was a barony at one time. There was still a difference. My granny stayed up by the park, and I used to go up every day. And I remember clearly walking up there, just a young laddie, and doing no harm to anybody. And they were playing football. Lift the ball, here's somebody for the Nungate. But that was just an isolated incident, and that wee feeling between the Nungate gang and the town gang.
Actually, I was born in the Vert Hospital, and the first house in the Nungate was number 1 Balfour Street. Strange enough, I lived in 3 houses in Balfour Street. From number 1, when I was just an infant, we moved to number 19, which was at the top of the road. Due to family circumstances, my grandma and my granddad stayed with us then. And after they died, my Uncle Jack came to live with me, and we moved to number 9 in the middle of Balfour Street. Well, I think there was lots of families lived in the poorer parts of Haddington. I think it was called maybe a slum clearance scheme, really, which was a term they used in those days. And quite a number of families, big families, moved into the Nungate about 1936. It was 4 in a block, actually, with an outside back stair. And we were up the stairs on the right-hand side.
Exactly the date these houses were built in Sprotton's Crescent, I don't know. But blocks of four. Willie Aiken was in before you, he was in the block before us. And we were downstairs, and Mrs. Kearney upstairs. And the other upstairs one was a Mrs. Wark, downstairs was a Mrs. Sandy. We each had our own garden. Downstairs we had one in the front and a bit at the back, which you turned into a drying green. Right. But you didn't, in these days you didn't have a lawn at the front of the house. You put your tatties and your turnips and that, because it was a bigger bit than what we had at the back, where the drying green was. And then beyond our drying green, there were another 2 gardens, one for each of the upstairs houses. So they had to come downstairs, down a pathway and in.
I was born in the Vert, 7th girl born in the Vert Hospital.
But were your family living in the Nungate at that time?
No. They were actually staying in a recreation club up the stair there. There was flats above it, and that's where I started off. And then at 3-year-old we went to Bear Terrace. Okay. Houses were just being built. I was there until I got married in 1951, and I went to stay in Meadow Park, in my granny's house at Meadow Park. And from there we went over to the Nungate when my father-in-law got really hard up, so we went over there to stay, and we were there for 30 years.
During that time you were the licensee of the Long Bar?
In 1961 my husband started. My father-in-law retired in 1960, and he only lived for a year. We took it in 61.
It was a big family. There was 11 members, brothers and sisters to my dad. My granddad, William Ingle, had come to live in Haddington in the 1920s. His family originated from Yorkshire, and his wife, Mary Jane Drummond, was her name, and she was of the travelling people. William, my grandfather, he was always called Skipper. That was his nickname. There's a number of stories have been told. The one that's most likely, there was never any connection with the sea. That's the first thing, because most people ask Skipper was he, and it wasn't. But there is a connection with the river, because when he was young, there used to be a wee boatman that used to take his boat out just at the ford, just for like joyrides, or whatever you call them in a boat. And there is some suggestion that when Skipper was just a boy, he would accompany or help the person, and that's where the skipper comes in. Now, I don't know if that's absolutely true, but it does tie in, because there's no other, reason for skipper.
It's a hard thing to say, because obviously I was born in the Nungate, but you were never a townie. You could maybe say that you're looked down on from the town people compared with anywhere else. So you've got to remember that gone back a lot of number of years, and it was always Haddington, Nungate and Gifford Gate That's how it was addressed way back in the days.
So was there a sort of rivalry between the young people, though?
Oh, there always was compared with in my days in Nungate and town. When you went out of the town, the town people would say, "Oh, here's the Nungateans coming out. We better get."
I recall the lodging houses where the Irishmen all stayed. We were quite scared of them as kids. They were Irish labourers they came over from Ireland, and in that lodging house, a great big stove about half the size of this table, just fuel underneath. It stunk. We used to come back from school. Well, we came over the old Nungate Bridge from school, and once we got near the lodging house, we used to run like the clobbers. And they were harmless. Charlie O'Brien, he was one of them. He was a real noble old Irish man, really. A lot of them were there, that was their permanent home.
Oh, really?
Aye. They were working on the farms or labouring, any kind of work they could get. People worked and worked.
Well, it was quite easy to survive in East Lothian because the Garden of Scotland, look at the farms and the farmers got men, and there were a man called Mr. Briggs, well, the back of the George Hotel, he had a wee office there, and he used to get so much for each person he gave to the farmers, and the farmers employed a lot of people. Like Haddington, absolutely dependent on farmers. Still, yeah. The thing is, Ritchie and Jenkinson's, they were big market gardeners, and they had lorries coming down, and they stopped round about the bottom of the town and picked up people. And my mother was there with some sandwiches, and we jumped to one lorry, my uncle's lorry, into another lorry, way up to Ritchie's, and worked overtime. The berries, there's weed and beetroot.
We used to get squads of women for a while from Haddington, from the Nungate, and you had to come in with a car and cart about half a dozen folk out to make up a squad. Usually you wanted a squad of anything from 10 to 15 when you were lifting the potatoes. But Haddington Nungate was where we used to get them. Then eventually you got round to the prisoners.
Another early memory is that there was a prisoner of war camp in Amesfield Park, and when we were boys we used to go along because the prisoners used to work in the fields, and they came back in the lorries at night, and we used to go along and cheekily ask them, "Have you got any German coin?" Another memory too is that some of the Nungate ladies, they knew that there was going to be a big number of prisoners coming back, and they were going to go along to the Amesfield Park to kind of scoff at them, really. It was such a pitiful sight, this long, from the park gate right down to the cemetery, this line of prisoners coming up. They realised, they were just like their own sons, completely changed their attitude.
Yeah.
But they made a transformation to the park because they really restored it in a way. They had a lovely miniature village built just at the park gates, which was much admired.
We were actually involved in the flood in 1948, and we had to go upstairs to our neighbours upstairs. Had to vacate the house at that particular time. We had to go out the so-called kitchen. In the days it was called the scullery, the scullery window. I think it was about a day or so of rain, and of course the town at that time flooded quite easily. And as I say, that my father jumped out of the window to catch us in the way, and it took him up to his chest.
So the water came in just like that?
And as I say, when it came into the house, it was a case of what are we going to do next, and that was that. So we stayed the night upstairs. Not so much furniture, because in the days you hadn't enough and we hadn't carpets. Is what most of the damage is done in the flooded areas now. It was so-called the linoleum in the days, and that was that. Every year the town always flooded, and St Martin's Gate and all they were all more or less flooded every year, round about the August time. So as I say, every August it was more or less flooded.
It was quite interesting to watch. The thing is, over there, it was really self-contained because of the shops that we had over there, as you've probably been told. With Lissy Barry's and Bob Dewar's. It could exist, and I mean, there was a licensed grocer's shop down at Gifford Gate, just at where Ford Road meets up on the right-hand side. Because that was one of the things that we did as bairns, following morning after the flood. Now, there were stacked the joiners over there, and the gates were washed off, big gates. And a couple of us got hold of one of these, and a big bit of stick, and we used it as a raft. And we went down Ford Road and down by Jim Malcolm's, and there had been a great big branch of a tree had smashed his window in. And as we sailed past there, we popped our hand in the window and lifted a couple of Mars bars, then sailed on under the bridge.
I think at the end of the day, well, I think it was a much more community-based than the rest of the town. I genuinely believe that. And that was reflected in the way people's attitudes towards each other. I didn't think there was keeping up with the Jones mentality, dare I say it. I mean, I think that there was this idea that it was tough, and I'm not saying it, I'm not starry-eyed about it. It was tough, and there was fights, and there was social problems that you get in other places. People were straightforward. You could have a laugh. They had that. I keep on coming back to the gala. I restarted the gala 20 years ago, but they'd started the gala with people who they got nothing for the town council. It was self-help, and that's what they done. This was 1945, the war was there wasn't much going about. The people decided, they got together, the people who were there, set up a wee committee, established a gala. Haddington didn't have a festival. That didn't happen until the 1960s.
You were a fine chappie, you were a Barry gadget. Barry was the next time, you got that one?
And the Manishi?
Aye, Manishi, that was the girls. She was a Barry Manishi. The Barry Manishi and the Barry Gadget, and the Manishis and the Gadgets got married.
And Deek?
Deek, I see.
And Panny?
Panny, that's the river. That's actually Indian origin, which is possible that a lot of these hawkers and that came from India, etc.
Goodies?
Aye, sweeties.
Chavy?
Child.
Kia?
Kia, that's your house.
Sherry?
Your sherry's your head.
Stardy?
Police.
And Yerrican?
Yerrican, these were the Irishmen.